had always considered myself a fiercely protective mother, perhaps even overly so at times, a trait undoubtedly forged in the crucible of single parenthood, a mantle I had willingly, if sometimes wearily, shouldered. Since the devastatingly premature loss of my beloved husband Emily's father, to a sudden aggressive illness when our daughter was just a toddler, a mere whisper of the vibrant young woman she was now becoming. My daughter Emily was quite simply my world, the radiant, irreplaceable sun around which my own universe had lovingly, willingly, and with an almost sacred devotion revolved for 17 challenging, rewarding, and often breathtakingly beautiful years. I, Sarah Miller, a moderately successful and passionately dedicated freelance graphic designer, had raised her largely on my own, navigating the often treacherous waters of adolescence, of academic pressures, of burgeoning social complexities with what I hoped was a judicious blend of unwavering support, gentle guidance, and an unshakable belief in her innate goodness, her sharp intellect, and her boundless potential. Every decision I made, every sacrifice I willingly, almost unconsciously endured, every late night I spent hunched over my glowing design tablet long after Emily was sound asleep in her own room was all ultimately, unequivocally for her. To provide her with a stable, nurturing, and unconditionally loving home, to afford her a quality education that would open doors to a future of her own choosing, and above all, to instill in her an unwavering, profound belief that she could achieve anything, absolutely anything she set her bright, ambitious, and wonderfully creative mind to. Emily, now a vibrant, intelligent, and strikingly beautiful 17-year-old on the very cusp of her senior year of high school, a young woman brimming with dreams of attending a prestigious art college on the East Coast, was, I believed with every fiber of my being, a shining testament to that unwavering, all-consuming, and deeply fulfilling maternal devotion. So when Emily, my usually so open, so communicative, so joyfully, almost transparently expressive, daughter first introduced me with a shy, almost breathless excitement to Mark Peterson, her new boyfriend, my initial reaction after the usual maternal trepidation that accompanies any new romantic interest in one's child's life was one of cautious but undeniably hopeful optimism. He was on the surface at least everything a discerning if perpetually anxious mother might tentatively, almost prayerfully hope for in her precious daughter's first serious romantic entanglement. 19 years old, a handsome, clean-cut freshman at the local city college with a declared and suitably ambitious major in business administration, he was impeccably polite, almost deferential in his interactions with me. Undeniably handsome in a classic boy next door sort of way, and possessed an easy, articulate, almost practiced charm that could, I had to grudgingly, silently admit, disarm even my own naturally skeptical and fiercely protective maternal radar. He came. Emily had breathlessly, almost reverently informed me in a series of excited, whispered phone calls and secretive late-night text messages from what she described with a teenager's characteristic lack of nuance and an almost comical degree of wide-eyed awe as a really, really nice, super successful, and incredibly wealthy family, the Petersons. They apparently owned a string of highly prosperous and very well-regarded local businesses, a chain of upscale restaurants, a boutique hotel, a couple of exclusive art galleries, and resided, Emily reported with a new, almost unfamiliar note of aspirational longing in her voice, in a sprawling, almost palatial and rather ostentatiously decorated home in the exclusive, old money, and notoriously insular enclave of Willow Creek, a privileged, gilded world, literally and metaphorically miles away from our own modest, comfortable, but decidedly less grandiose and infinitely more down-to-earth suburban neighborhood. My first, and for a long time, only direct meeting with Mark when Emily, after weeks of nervous anticipation and meticulous planning on her part, finally brought him home for a carefully vetted and, for me, rather anxiety-inducing family dinner. A dinner for which I, in my own maternal desire to make a good impression, to not embarrass my daughter, confess, I had spent an inordinate, almost comical amount of time meticulously planning the menu, obsessively cleaning our already spotless house, and even, to my own retrospective shame, considering briefly renting more impressive tableware, did little to dispel that initial cautiously favorable impression. He was, as advertised, the epitome of politeness, of respectful deference. He complimented my cooking with a sincerity that seemed at the time entirely genuine. He engaged in intelligent, articulate conversation about a surprisingly wide range of topics from current events to classic literature. Asking thoughtful, insightful questions about my own freelance graphic design work, a level of interest no previous teenage boyfriend of Emily's had ever even remotely displayed. And most importantly, most reassuringly for my maternal heart, he looked at Emily, my Emily, with an expression of such open, unadulterated, almost reverent adoration that it melted even my most deeply entrenched, most fiercely guarded maternal reservations. He seemed in those initial deceptively golden hours to be everything I could have hoped for my daughter: kind, intelligent, ambitious, respectful, and clearly deeply in love with her. A few weeks later, an invitation engraved on thick, creamy, and undoubtedly very expensive cardstock arrived for Emily. It was from Mrs. Peterson Mark's mother, inviting Emily to join the Peterson family for Sunday dinner at their Willow Creek estate. This invitation Emily and I both viewed as a significant, positive, and deeply encouraging step in their burgeoning and apparently quite serious relationship. Emily spent days agonizing over what to wear, what to say, how to act. I, in turn, offered what I hoped was calm, sensible maternal advice, while privately, my own heart fluttered with a mixture of vicarious excitement for my daughter and a familiar, lingering maternal anxiety. She returned from that Sunday dinner at the Peterson home late in the evening, her usually so expressive face flushed with an almost uncharacteristic, almost manic, and slightly unnerving enthusiasm. She recounted in a torrent of breathless, almost reverent detail the almost unimaginable grandeur of their home. Mom, it was literally like something out of a glossy architectural magazine. Marble floors, a swimming pool, a tennis court. The overwhelming warmth and absolutely incredible kindness of Mrs. Peterson Mark's mother, who had apparently treated her like a princess. The hilarious, down-to-earth jokes of Mr. Peterson, his father, who, had she gushed, made her feel instantly at ease. And the super cool, totally friendly, and not at all snobby demeanor of Mark's two younger and apparently equally perfect sisters. They had, according to Emily's star-struck, almost worshipful account, welcomed her with open, effusive arms, showering her with compliments on her, my carefully chosen dress, her intelligence, her manners expressing their unreserved delight at Mark's excellent, impeccable taste in girlfriends, and making her feel in her own oft-repeated and slightly concerning words, like a real-life princess, like a cherished, instantly and unconditionally accepted member of their seemingly perfect, incredibly loving, and enviably affluent family. Even I, listening to her rhapsodize to her almost giddy fairy tale-like recounting of the evening, felt a wave of genuine, profound relief, of heartfelt, almost tearful gratitude. My daughter, my precious, deserving Emily, it seemed, was not only deeply, wonderfully happy, but also safe, welcomed, cherished, and perhaps even on the very cusp of finding a second loving, supportive, and incredibly advantageous family. Oh, the tragic, devastating, and almost unbearable irony of that naive, hopeful, and ultimately so catastrophically misguided maternal benediction. The subtle, almost imperceptible, yet deeply, chillingly unsettling shifts in Emily's usually so sunny, so open, so vibrantly, almost transparently expressive demeanor began insidiously like a creeping, unwelcome, and initially unidentifiable fog, a few short but intense months into her increasingly serious and visibly all-consuming relationship with Mark Peterson. At first, they were such small, almost trivial things, the kind of fleeting, ambiguous behavioral nuances that a loving and perhaps overly optimistic mother like myself could easily, almost willingly dismiss, could readily, almost gratefully rationalize away as the normal, predictable, and entirely understandable emotional undulations of a young woman, navigating the intense, often bewildering, and notoriously volatile currents of first serious, all-encompassing love. She became almost overnight. It sometimes seemed quieter, more withdrawn, less inclined to share the spontaneous, often comical minutiae of her day with me over our shared, usually lively dinner table. Her usual infectious room-filling laughter, the joyful, almost constant, and deeply cherished soundtrack to our cozy home, became noticeably painfully less frequent, replaced by a new, unfamiliar, and often rather forced politeness. A strained, almost artificial cheerfulness that didn't quite reach her usually so expressive, luminous eyes. The long, animated, and often delightfully rambling after-school conversations we had always shared. Conversations that had once been filled with the intricate details of her classes, the latest dramas of her friendship circle, her burgeoning hopes for art college, her anxieties about upcoming exams dwindled alarmingly, then almost ceased entirely. They were replaced more often than not by monosyllabic, almost grudging responses to my increasingly concerned, though I tried to keep them light and casual inquiries. Or more distressingly, by a new, almost furtive and deeply uncharacteristic reluctance to share anything at all about her time spent with Mark, or with his seemingly so welcoming, so perfect family. Her bedroom door once almost always ajar, a welcoming unspoken invitation for me to pop in for impromptu chats, for shared cups of herbal tea, for cozy late-night mother-daughter heart-to-hearts, was now with a new, almost aggressive finality, more often than not, firmly, almost defiantly closed, sometimes even to my growing unease, locked from the inside. The muffled, often indecipherable sounds of hushed, intense, and frequently very lengthy phone conversations with Mark. Conversations that often seemed to end not with laughter but with a strained, almost tearful silence, would often drift out from beneath that closed door late into the night, long after she should have been asleep, long after I myself had retired to my own increasingly restless, anxiety-filled bed. I tried with all the maternal tact, with all the gentle, non-judgmental understanding I could muster, to probe, to inquire, to create a safe, open space for her to share whatever might be troubling her. "Everything okay with you and Mark, sweetie?" I'd ask, my tone deliberately light, carefully casual as I buttered toast for her at breakfast. "You seem a little preoccupied lately, a little quiet." Her responses were invariably and increasingly defensive, almost evasive. "Everything's fine, Mom, really." She'd reply a little too quickly. Her eyes, those beautiful, expressive eyes that I knew so well, refusing to meet mine, her gaze often fixed intently on her phone screen or on some indeterminate point just beyond my shoulder. "Mark's great. His family's great. We're great. Just, busy, stressed with school stuff. You worry too much." And I, desperate to believe her, desperate to maintain the illusion of her happiness, of her well-being, of the continued, uncomplicated normalcy of our lives, would often, too often let it go, would accept her flimsy, unconvincing reassurances at face value, chiding myself internally for being an overly anxious, perhaps even slightly paranoid mother, for projecting my own past relationship anxieties onto my daughter's seemingly idyllic, blossoming romance. But the unsettling changes in Emily's behavior, in her very essence, continued subtly but relentlessly to escalate. Her once vibrant, eclectic personal style, her love for brightly colored, slightly bohemian clothes, her penchant for quirky artistic accessories began to morph almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably into something far more subdued, more conservative, more Peterson-esque. I couldn't help but think, with a growing uncomfortable lurch in my stomach. She started asking with an uncharacteristic, almost apologetic hesitancy for money to buy new clothes. More appropriate clothes, she'd explained, for dinners at the Petersons' home, for outings with Mark and his more sophisticated college friends. Clothes that, when they appeared, were invariably in muted, neutral tones from expensive classic brands. I knew we couldn't truly afford brands that seemed entirely alien to Emily's usual more free-spirited artistic sensibilities. Her once passionate engagement with her own art, her beloved sketching and painting, the very soul of her creative being, began to wane. Her dusty sketchbook lay increasingly, heartbreakingly unopened on her desk. Her easel in the corner of her room gathered a thin film of disuse. When I gently, worriedly inquired, she would offer vague, dismissive excuses. "Oh, I haven't had much inspiration lately, Mom." Or, "Mark says." Mark thinks I should focus more on my academic subjects right now. You know, the ones that will actually get me into a good college, a good career. Art is, well, it's more of a hobby, isn't it? His words, his opinions, his preferences were becoming with an alarming, insidious frequency. Her words, her opinions, her preferences. It was as if her own vibrant, unique personality was being slowly, systematically, subtly yet undeniably erased, replaced by a paler, more muted, more acceptable version of version carefully curated, I increasingly, terrifyingly suspected to please Mark, and more importantly, to gain the continued conditional approval of his formidable and clearly highly judgmental family. The physical manifestations of her distress, though she tried so desperately, so heartbreakingly to conceal them, also began to emerge. There were the dark, smudged circles of exhaustion that seemed to have taken up permanent residence beneath her usually so bright, so expressive eyes, a testament to countless sleepless, anxiety-ridden nights. There was a new, almost constant nervous fidgeting of her hands, a subtle but persistent tremor that I, her mother, who knew her every nuance, every gesture, could not fail to notice. And then there were the clothes. The long-sleeved blouses, the high-necked sweaters worn even on unseasonably warm autumn days, clothes that seemed designed not for fashion or even for comfort, but for concealment. It was a late Saturday afternoon, a few months into this increasingly unsettling new reality. Emily had just returned from what she had vaguely described as a family barbecue at the Petersons' Willow Creek estate. She seemed unusually quiet, almost withdrawn her responses to my cheerful inquiries about her day, monosyllabic, almost evasive. As she was heading up to her room, I noticed a small, almost imperceptible tear in the sleeve of her delicate silk blouse. A blouse I knew was one of her favorites. "Oh, sweetie, you've torn your sleeve," I said, reaching out instinctively to examine the damage. "What happened? Did it catch on something?" She flinched almost violently, pulling her arm away from my touch, as if scalded her eyes when they met mine wide with a sudden, inexplicable, almost hunted panic. It's nothing, Mom," she stammered, her voice a little too high, a little too shrill. Just a stupid accident. I snagged it on a rose bush in Mrs. Peterson's garden." "No big deal. I'll fix it later." And then, before I could say another word, before I could even begin to process her strangely overwrought, almost hysterical reaction, she turned and fled up the stairs, disappearing into the supposed sanctuary of her bedroom, the door clicking shut behind her with a sharp, almost definitive finality. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding a sudden, heavy, premonitory drumbeat against my ribs. A rose bush. Her reaction, her panic, her desperate need to escape my scrutiny felt entirely disproportionately out of sync with such a minor everyday accident. A cold, sickening dread, a dread far deeper, far more terrifying than any I had yet experienced, began to uncoil in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. And my daughter, my precious beloved Emily, was, I now feared, with an almost unbearable, soul-crushing certainty, in far deeper, far more dangerous trouble than I could have ever in my wildest, most fearful maternal imaginings conceived. The gilded cage of her perfect romance, I sensed with a chilling, visceral prescience, might in fact be a place of unimaginable, hidden torment. The image of Emily's panicked flight up the stairs, the almost visceral recoil when I had reached for her arm, the stark, hunted fear I had seen flickering in her usually so open, so expressive eyes. These disturbing fragments replayed themselves in my mind with an agonizing, relentless clarity throughout that long, sleepless Saturday night. The flimsy excuse she had offered, snagging her sleeve on a rose bush in Mrs. Peterson's meticulously manicured, and I now recalled with a sudden chilling detail, entirely thornless hybrid tea rose garden, felt transparently, almost insultingly false. My maternal intuition, that deep, primal, often inexplicable but rarely mistaken sense of knowing when my child was in distress, was now screaming at full volume, a deafening internal siren warning of imminent and potentially grave danger. I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the knot of ice forming in my stomach that I could no longer afford to tiptoe around Emily's sensitivities, her understandable desire for privacy, her teenage reluctance to confide in her overprotective mother. The stakes I sensed were far too high. This was no longer about a typical adolescent mood swing or the normal, albeit often painful ups and downs of a first serious romance. This felt different. Darker, more insidious. The next morning, a bright, deceptively cheerful Sunday, I waited until Emily emerged from her room, her eyes still shadowed with a weariness that belied her youth, her movements still tinged with that strange new, almost furtive guardedness. I approached her gently, my own voice carefully modulated to convey calm, loving concern rather than accusation or panic, though inside my heart was pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm. Emily, sweetheart. I began sitting beside her at our small kitchen table as she listlessly pushed a piece of toast around her plate. About your blouse yesterday, and about a few other things I've been noticing lately. You seem a little unhappy, honey. A little stressed. Is there something you want to talk to me about? You know, you can tell me anything, don't you? Absolutely anything. And I will always, always be on your side. She didn't look at me. Her gaze remained fixed on the unappetizing piece of toast, her fingers nervously pleating the edge of her napkin. I'm fine. Mom, really? She mumbled, her voice low, almost inaudible. Just a lot of school stuff. And Mark and I had a stupid little argument yesterday. It was nothing. Really. Don't worry about it. Her words, so dismissive, so clearly evasive, only served to heighten my already profound sense of unease. A stupid little argument, Emily, I pressed gently but with a new, unyielding firmness in my tone. An argument that resulted in a torn blouse, and you looking like you haven't slept in a week. An argument that makes you flinch when I try to touch your arm. At that, her head snapped up, her eyes, those beautiful, expressive eyes that were usually so full of light, now wide, almost wild with a mixture of fear, defiance, and a dawning, horrified comprehension that I was not going to let this go, that I was not going to be so easily placated by her flimsy teenage deflections. It was nothing, Mom, she insisted, her voice rising now tinged with a desperate, almost hysterical edge. Just leave it alone, okay? It's my life, it's my relationship. You don't understand. Then help me understand, Emily, I said, my voice still quiet, still gentle, but infused with an unshakable maternal resolve. Because right now, all I understand is that my daughter, the daughter I love more than life itself, is hurting. And she's trying to hide it from me. And that sweetheart that hurts me more than you can possibly imagine. And then I did something I had sworn to myself I would only do as an absolute last resort, something that felt like a profound betrayal of her trust, yet something I now knew with a sickening, desperate certainty I had to do to protect her. I reached out gently but firmly and took her arm, the one with the torn sleeve, from the previous day. And before she could pull away, before she could protest, I carefully, purposefully rolled up the delicate silk fabric. The sight that greeted me there in the bright, unforgiving morning sunlight streaming through our kitchen window made the air leave my lungs in a single sharp, incredulous gasp. A gasp that was quickly followed by a wave of such profound, visceral, all-consuming maternal rage that I thought for a terrifying moment I might actually be physically sick. There, on the tender pale skin of my daughter's forearm, were not just one, but a series of distinct, ugly, and undeniably recent bruises. Finger-shaped bruises, bluish-purple tinged with an angry telltale yellow at the edges. The kind of bruises that are left when an arm is gripped too tightly, too forcefully, too violently. Emily, I whispered, my voice a choked, horrified sound I barely recognized as my own. Oh my God, Emily! What? What is this? What have they done to you?" Her carefully constructed facade of defiance of denial crumbled completely, then collapsing in on itself like a house of cards in a hurricane. A single large tear escaped from the corner of her eye, then another and another, until she was sobbing great, body-racking, heartbroken sobs burying her face in her hands, her slender shoulders shaking with the force of her unrestrained, long-suppressed grief, her fear, her shame. And as I held my weeping, trembling daughter in my arms, rocking her gently murmuring incoherent words of comfort, of love, of a fierce, unyielding promise of protection, the horrifying, unspeakable, and now undeniable truth of her relationship with Mark Peterson and with his seemingly so perfect, so welcoming family began to pour out of her a torrent of pain, of humiliation, of fear. A story so dark, so twisted, so utterly at odds with the gilded, charming facade they presented to the world that it chilled me to the very marrow of my bones. Emily's confession, when it finally, agonizingly emerged from the depths of her shame and terror, was not a coherent linear narrative, but a fragmented, tear-choked torrent of painful memories, of humiliating incidents, of a slowly dawning, horrifying realization that the fairy tale romance she thought she had found with Mark Peterson and the warm, welcoming embrace of his seemingly perfect family was in reality a meticulously crafted gilded cage, a place of insidious emotional manipulation, of escalating verbal abuse, and now terrifyingly of physical violence. She spoke her voice often, barely a whisper, her words punctuated by shuddering sobs and long, desolate silences of how the Petersons' initial almost overwhelming warmth and effusive charm had over the ensuing months subtly, insidiously begun to morph into something far more controlling, more critical, more suffocating. It started with Mrs. Peterson, Eleanor Marks' impeccably dressed, silver-tongued mother, a woman whose initial almost maternal kindness towards Emily had gradually, almost imperceptibly transformed into a constant barrage of thinly veiled criticisms of unsolicited and often deeply undermining advice. Emily, dear Eleanor, would say, her voice a carefully modulated purr that somehow managed to convey both solicitous concern and a chilling underlying disapproval. "That little bohemian skirt you're so fond of. It's charming, of course, for a young girl. But perhaps when you're dining with our family, something a little more classic, a little more appropriate, might be more suitable. First impressions, you know. Especially with Mark bringing you to the club next week. Or your grades in AP history are commendable, Emily. But Mark tells me your calculus scores are, shall we say, less than stellar. Perhaps you should focus your energies a little more on subjects that will actually benefit his future career path. A supportive partner, you understand, is such an asset to an ambitious young man like our Mark." These comments, initially dismissed by Emily as perhaps well-intentioned, if somewhat old-fashioned and overly critical, soon escalated in frequency, in intensity, in their insidious, soul-crushing negativity. Mrs. Peterson, often abetted by Mark's two younger, equally snobbish and entitled sisters, Amanda and Claire, began to meticulously dissect and invariably find wanting every aspect of Emily's being. Her clothes, her hair, her choice of friends, her old loyal friends from our own neighborhood whom they deemed unsuitable and beneath her, her academic aspirations, her passionate desire to attend art college was dismissed as frivolous and impractical. Even to my utter horrified disbelief, her very laugh, which they once in Emily's tearful recounting described as a little too loud, a little too unrestrained, for a young lady of quality. And Mark, my charming, polite, adores Emily, Mark. He, it turned out, was not the loving, protective boyfriend I, and more tragically, Emily had so naively believed him to be. He was instead a weak, spineless, and ultimately complicit enabler of his family's escalating campaign of emotional abuse. When Emily, hurt and bewildered by their constant criticisms, would later try to confide in him to seek his support, his defense, He would invariably side with his mother with his sisters. "Oh, come on, Em," he'd say with a dismissive, almost irritated shrug. "You're being too sensitive. She just has very high standards. She just wants what's best for us. For you. Can't you just try a little harder to fit in? To please her? It's not that difficult, is it?" His words, his casual dismissal of her pain, his blatant prioritization of his mother's approval over her well-being were, Emily confessed through fresh waves of heartbroken sobs, often even more wounding, more devastating than the direct attacks from his family. She began to feel increasingly isolated, trapped, her self-confidence, once so vibrant, so resilient, systematically, cruelly eroded, replaced by a gnawing self-doubt, a desperate, futile desire to somehow impossibly gain their acceptance, their approval. Then, inevitably, the emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the insidious gaslighting began to escalate into something far more terrifying, far more tangible physical intimidation, and then overt physical violence. It started. Emily recounted, her voice now barely a choked whisper, her small body trembling uncontrollably in my arms with Mrs. Peterson, during a particularly heated discussion about Emily's unsuitable choice of college major. She had dared to reaffirm her unwavering passion for art rather than acceding to Mrs. Peterson's imperious suggestion of a more practical business degree to better support Mark's future, of course, Eleanor Peterson. Her face contorted with a sudden, shocking, almost reptilian fury had grabbed Emily's arm, her fingers adorned with several large, sharp-edged diamond rings, digging painfully into Emily's tender flesh, her voice a low, menacing hiss. "You will listen to me, you ungrateful little chit. You will do as you are told. You are lucky my son even deigns to associate with someone of your background." That incident. Emily confessed her shame. A palpable, suffocating presence in the room had been the source of the first set of bruises, the ones she had so desperately, so pathetically tried to attribute to a rosebush. Mark had been present. He had seen it all, and he had done nothing. Absolutely nothing. He had simply stood by his face, pale, his eyes averted, a silent, complicit witness to his own mother's assault on the girl he supposedly loved. After that, the physical intimidation, the occasional shoves, the tight, bruising grips on her arm, the slammed doors, the objects thrown in anger, though never directly at her, not yet became an increasingly frequent, if still somewhat unpredictable, component of her visits to the Peterson family's perfect Willow Creek home. It was usually, Emily explained, when she dared to disagree, to assert her own opinion, to resist their relentless attempts to mold her, to control her, to transform her into their idealized, subservient version of Mark's perfect, suitable girlfriend. And Mark, my once so charming, so polite, so seemingly devoted Mark, he either actively participated in the verbal abuse, echoing his mother's criticisms, his sister's snide remarks, or at best remained a passive, silent, and therefore, in my eyes, equally culpable bystander. The final devastating incident, the one that had led to her torn blouse, her hunted fear, her ultimate heartbreaking confession to me, had occurred just the previous afternoon at that family barbecue. Emily, it seemed, had dared to politely decline Mrs. Peterson's imperious suggestion that she forgo her long-planned and already paid-for summer art program in favor of a more suitable, family-oriented, 2-week vacation with the Petersons at their exclusive, members-only lakeside resort. Her refusal, however politely phrased, had apparently triggered an explosive, terrifying rage in Eleanor Peterson, a rage that had culminated in Mrs. Peterson grabbing Emily by both arms, shaking her violently, her voice a torrent of vicious, demeaning insults, calling Emily ungrateful, selfish, willfully disobedient, a common little gold digger who didn't know her place. Mark's sisters, Amanda and Claire, had Emily recounted with a fresh wave of shuddering sobs, merely stood by, smirking, offering a few encouraging, "Yeah, Mom, you tell her" remarks. And Mark? Mark had once again done nothing, said nothing. He had simply watched his face, a mask of impassive, perhaps even bored indifference, as his mother and sisters verbally and now physically savaged the girl he professed to love. My heart as I listened to my daughter's raw, agonizing, almost unbelievable account of the systematic escalating abuse she had endured felt as though it were being slowly, methodically crushed in an iron vice. The pain, the rage, the profound, almost suffocating sense of maternal guilt for my own blindness, my own failure to protect her sooner, was almost unbearable. How could I have been so fooled? How could I have so misjudged Mark Peterson, his seemingly so charming, so respectable family? They weren't just snobbish or critical or overbearing. They were monsters, abusers, and they had been systematically cruelly destroying my daughter's spirit, her confidence, her very sense of self-right under my supposedly watchful, loving eyes. But even as the tears streamed down my own face as I held my trembling, broken child in my arms, a new, unfamiliar, and terrifyingly potent emotion began to surge through me, an emotion that burned away the grief, the guilt, the despair, replacing it with a cold, hard, diamond-edged, and utterly unshakable righteous fury. A lioness's fury. They had hurt my cub. They had violated my most sacred trust. And they, the entire despicable Peterson clan, were about to learn in no uncertain and undoubtedly very painful terms the true, unmitigated, and absolutely terrifying power of a mother's love, a mother's rage, a mother's unwavering, unconditional, and utterly non-negotiable vow to protect her child at any cost against any enemy, however powerful, however privileged, however seemingly untouchable they might believe themselves to be. The time for quiet observation, for polite deference, for hopeful optimism was over. The time for war, for a mother's righteous avenging war, had well and truly and irrevocably begun. The hours immediately following Emily's devastating, heartbreaking confession were for me a blur of almost preternatural calm, a chilling, focused clarity that seemed to descend upon me, banishing the earlier incapacitating waves of raw, chaotic emotion. My daughter, my precious, vulnerable Emily, was asleep now, finally in her own bed, her tear-ravaged face still pale, still etched with the shadows of her recent torment, but her breathing at last even regular, a small, fragile measure of peace restored at least for these few fleeting hours of blessed unconsciousness. I had sat with her holding her hand, stroking her hair, murmuring soothing, nonsensical words of love and reassurance until her exhausted, overwrought body had finally mercifully succumbed to the oblivion of sleep. But for me, Sarah Miller's sleep was an impossibility, a distant, irrelevant luxury. My mind was a whirlwind of focused, icy rage of meticulous strategic planning. The initial overwhelming shock of Emily's revelations, the profound, almost paralyzing maternal grief at the extent of her suffering had now coalesced, hardened into something far more potent, far more dangerous, an unshakable, unyielding, and utterly ruthless determination to not just protect my child from further harm, but to ensure that those who had inflicted such profound, unconscionable pain upon her, the entire despicable Peterson clan, faced tangible, significant, and deeply personally uncomfortable consequences for their actions. I knew with a clarity that was almost terrifying in its intensity that I would not allow this to be swept under the rug, to be dismissed as teenage drama or an unfortunate misunderstanding, as I had no doubt the Petersons, with their wealth, their influence, their ingrained sense of entitlement, would undoubtedly attempt to frame it should their actions ever be brought to light. No, this was not a misunderstanding. This was abuse. Physical, emotional, systematic abuse perpetrated against a vulnerable young woman by an entire family unit who clearly believed themselves to be above reproach, above consequence, above the common decencies of human behavior. My first and most immediate priority was, of course, Emily's safety, her emotional well-being. The restraining order against Mark Peterson, and by extension against his entire immediate family, was already in my mind a non-negotiable first step. But I knew that a piece of paper, however legally binding, would not be enough to truly heal the wounds they had inflicted. nor would it serve as a sufficient deterrent against future similar predatory behavior on their part, perhaps towards some other unsuspecting vulnerable young woman. No, what was required here was not just protection, but a reckoning. A public reckoning, if necessary. A reckoning that would strip away their carefully constructed facade of respectability, expose their hypocrisy, their cruelty, their moral bankruptcy to the harsh, unforgiving light of day. I spent the remainder of that long, dark night meticulously documenting every detail of Emily's account, her words still echoing with a chilling, heartbreaking clarity in my mind. I encouraged Emily the next morning, when she was a little calmer, a little stronger, to write down everything she could remember in her own words. Every instance of verbal abuse, of emotional manipulation, of physical intimidation, every threat, every insult, every demeaning comment. It was an agonizing, re-traumatizing process for her, I knew, but it was also Ms. Vance, the formidable employment lawyer, who had so brilliantly guided me through a previous, entirely unrelated but equally challenging workplace ordeal, would have undoubtedly advised a legally crucial step in building an irrefutable case. Though this was a different kind of battle, the principles of meticulous evidence gathering, I instinctively knew, remained the same. I also, with Emily's tearful but resolute consent, took detailed, dated photographs of the bruises still visible on her arms, on her shoulders, those silent, eloquent testaments to the Petersons' brutality. Each click of the camera shutter felt like another nail being driven into their coffin of lies, another piece of undeniable proof in my burgeoning arsenal of truth. My plan, when it began to fully crystallize in the cold, hard light of that new, defiant dawn, was not one of impetuous emotional confrontation, though every fiber of my being screamed for immediate cathartic retribution. No, I would be strategic. I would be methodical. I would be legal. I would consult with the best damn family law attorney I could find, someone specializing in domestic abuse and restraining orders. I would explore every available avenue to protect Emily and to hold the Petersons accountable, not just morally but legally, for their despicable actions. But before I set the official legal wheels in motion, before I unleashed the full formidable power of the judicial system upon them, there was one more thing I knew with an almost primal certainty I had to do. I had to confront them, directly, in their own gilded cage. Not to plead, not to negotiate, not to seek their understanding or their apology, for I knew with absolute certainty that they were capable of neither, but to deliver a message. A clear, unequivocal, and utterly terrifying message. A message from a mother whose child had been harmed. A message that they, in their arrogance, in their complacency, in their insulated world of privilege and impunity, would never, ever forget. I waited until the following Saturday afternoon, a time I knew from Emily's previous reluctant accounts of their family routines they would all likely be gathered at their Willow Creek estate for their usual ostentatious and undoubtedly entirely hypocritical family brunch. I didn't call ahead. I didn't request an appointment. I simply drove my heart a cold, hard knot of resolve in my chest, my hands gripping the steering wheel with a white-knuckled intensity directly to their imposing wrought iron gates. I, Sarah Miller, the unsuitable, gold-digging, not good enough mother, was about to pay an unexpected and entirely unwelcome social call. The lioness was at their door, and she was not there for brunch. The heavy, ornate, wrought iron gates of the Peterson estate, usually so imposing, so designed to convey an air of exclusive, unbreachable privacy, swung open with a surprising, almost anticlimactic ease as I announced my name, Sarah Miller, into the impersonal squawk of the intercom. Perhaps the weekend security guard was new, or perhaps more likely the name Miller simply didn't register as a threat, as anyone of consequence, in their rarefied, insulated world. I drove my modest, decade-old sedan slowly, deliberately up the long, winding, impeccably manicured driveway, parking it with a certain grim, defiant satisfaction directly in front of the grand, ostentatious three-story colonial monstrosity they called home, right beside Mark's gleaming, ridiculously oversized black Range Rover. I walked with a calm, measured, and utterly unwavering gait to the massive carved oak front door and pressed the ornate brass doorbell, the sound echoing with a strangely satisfying, almost theatrical resonance. In the cavernous marble-floored entryway, I could glimpse through the leaded glass sidelights. It was Mrs. Eleanor Peterson herself who opened the door, her perfectly coiffed silver hair immaculate, her expensive silk caftan flowing around her like a regal shroud. Her face upon seeing me standing on her doorstep transforming in a matter of seconds from an expression of polite, slightly surprised inquiry to one of dawning, horrified comprehension, then to a mask of cold, haughty, and clearly unwelcome disdain. "Ms. Miller," she began, her voice dripping with an icy, condescending formality. Her eyes, those pale reptilian blue eyes that had so often, so cruelly appraised and dismissed my daughter, now narrowed with a mixture of suspicion and outright hostility. "This is rather an unexpected and, I must say, entirely unwelcome intrusion. We are, as you can perhaps imagine, in the midst of a private family gathering." "What precisely do you want?" "I want to talk to you, Eleanor," I replied, my voice surprisingly steady, surprisingly calm, my gaze unwavering, meeting hers without a flicker of fear, without a hint of my former intimidation. "And to your husband, and to your son Mark, and to your daughters Amanda and Claire. I want to talk to all of you, about Emily, about what you as a family have done to my daughter." A flicker of something, fear, apprehension, crossed her usually so composed features, quickly masked by a renewed surge of arrogant indignation. "I have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," she snapped, her voice rising, becoming shrill. "If Emily has been filling your head with some fanciful adolescent nonsense, oh, it's far from nonsense. Eleanor," I interjected, my voice still quiet, but now imbued with an unmistakable, unyielding edge of steel. "And I have the photographs and my daughter's detailed sworn statement to prove it. Now, are you going to invite me in so we can discuss this like civilized human beings, or would you prefer I share Emily's story and these rather compelling photographs with the Willow Creek Police Department, and perhaps with a few select very interested local news reporters I happen to know? The choice, Eleanor, as always, is entirely yours." Her face, already pale, seemed to visibly drain of all remaining color. The threat, however politely delivered, was clear, unambiguous, and she knew with a certainty that must have been terrifying for a woman so accustomed to controlling every narrative, every outcome, that I was not bluffing. After a long, charged moment of silent internal calculation, she stepped back grudgingly from the doorway, her gesture a reluctant, almost imperceptible admission of defeat. "Very well, Ms. Miller." She conceded, her voice tight with a barely suppressed fury. "Come in, but make it quick, and I assure you you are sorely mistaken if you think—" I didn't wait for her to finish her blustering, self-serving pronouncements. I walked past her into the opulent, sun-drenched, and suddenly very silent Peterson family living room, where Mark, his father Richard, and his two sisters Amanda and Claire were. As I had anticipated, gathered their expressions a mixture of surprise, annoyance, and dawning uncomfortable apprehension as they registered my unexpected and clearly unwelcome presence. Emily, my brave, bruised Emily, was not with me. I had made the decision after much agonizing deliberation that she should not have to endure this initial, potentially explosive confrontation. This was my fight as her mother to wage on her behalf. Her healing would come later in a safer, more supportive environment. For the next hour, an hour that felt like an eternity, an hour, filled with a tension so thick, so palpable, it was almost suffocating, I laid out my case, calmly, methodically, relentlessly. I spoke of Emily's initial joy, her innocent trust, her genuine affection for Mark, for their family. I then, with a voice that trembled only slightly with the effort of maintaining my composure, detailed the insidious, escalating campaign of emotional abuse, of belittling criticisms, of manipulative control that she had endured at their collective hands. And then I produced the photographs, the undeniable, sickening visual proof of their physical violence, the bruises on my daughter's arms, on her shoulders, meticulously documented, dated, undeniable. As I spoke, as I presented the irrefutable evidence of their cruelty, their hypocrisy, their moral bankruptcy, I watched their carefully constructed facades of affluent respectability, of familial solidarity, begin to crack, then to crumble, then to utterly, comprehensively disintegrate. Richard Peterson, the patriarch, a man I had always perceived as somewhat weak-willed, but fundamentally decent, looked genuinely, profoundly horrified. His gaze fixed on the photographs with a mixture of disbelief and dawning paternal shame. Amanda and Claire Marks, usually so glib, so self-absorbed sisters, were for once rendered speechless, their faces pale, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning, uncomfortable guilt. And Mark, the charming, handsome golden boy, the object of my daughter's once so innocent, so trusting affection. He sat slumped in his expensive armchair, his head bowed, his face a mask of ashen, sweaty, and utterly pathetic self-pity. He offered no denials, no excuses, no defense. He couldn't. The evidence was too overwhelming, too damning, too true. Eleanor Peterson, however true to her manipulative, narcissistic form, tried one last desperate time to regain control, to twist the narrative, to deflect blame. She launched into a tirade accusing Emily of being oversensitive, provocative, ungrateful, even outrageously of seducing her innocent, impressionable son. She tried to dismiss the bruises as accidental, as exaggerated, as the result of a clumsy girl's own carelessness. But her lies, her desperate, transparent attempts at victim blaming, now fell on deaf ears, even within her own family. Richard Peterson, his face a mask of grim, weary resolve, finally belatedly found his voice, his paternal conscience. "Enough, Eleanor," he commanded, his voice low, gravelly, but carrying an undeniable weight of authority I had never heard from him before. "Enough lies, enough excuses. We have done a terrible, unforgivable thing to that child, to Emily, and to her mother, and we will make it right." The ensuing negotiations, if one could call the Petersons' shell-shocked, almost desperate attempts to mitigate the inevitable fallout, a negotiation, were brief and entirely one-sided. I, with the full backing of Laura Hayes, my lawyer, whom I had of course fully apprised of my intended confrontation, and who was at that very moment on standby, ready to file for an emergency restraining order and initiate civil proceedings should the Petersons prove recalcitrant, laid out my terms, my non-negotiable demands. A full, unequivocal, and legally binding restraining order preventing Mark Peterson and every member of his immediate family from ever contacting, approaching, or in any way harassing Emily or myself again. A substantial, undisclosed financial contribution to a dedicated trust fund for Emily to cover the costs of her ongoing therapy, her future educational expenses, and as a significant, tangible, if ultimately inadequate compensation for the profound emotional distress and physical harm she had endured. And finally, a formal written apology not just from Mark, but from Eleanor, Richard, Amanda, and Claire Peterson individually and collectively to be delivered to Emily. Personally, an apology, acknowledging their abusive behavior, expressing their profound remorse, and begging for her forgiveness. A forgiveness I made it abundantly clear that she was under absolutely no obligation whatsoever to grant. Faced with the undeniable evidence, the very real threat of public exposure of criminal charges, of protracted reputation-destroying legal battles, and perhaps, just perhaps, a tiny nascent flicker of genuine, albeit far too late, human remorse, the Petersons, after a brief, hushed, and undoubtedly agonizing family conference, capitulated. Completely. They agreed to all of my terms. The victory, when it came, was not sweet, not triumphant in the way I had perhaps in my angrier moments envisioned. There was no cheering, no fist-pumping, no satisfying sense of vindictive retribution. Instead, there was just a profound, almost overwhelming sense of weary, sorrowful relief. I had done what I had to do. I had protected my daughter. I had faced down the monsters, and I had in some small significant way ensured that justice, however imperfect, however belated, had been served. The aftermath for Emily was a long, slow, and often painful journey of healing. The emotional scars, I knew, would likely linger far longer than the faded bruises on her skin. But with the unwavering support of her mother, with the compassionate guidance of an excellent therapist, and with the innate, remarkable resilience of youth, she began slowly, painstakingly to rebuild her shattered confidence, her fractured trust, her belief in her own inherent worth, her own bright, unblemished future. She eventually did go to that prestigious art college on the East Coast, where she blossomed both as an artist and as a strong, independent, and wonderfully compassionate young woman. She learned through this excruciating ordeal some of life's hardest, most invaluable lessons about the deceptive nature of appearances, about the importance of trusting her own instincts, about the courage to speak out against abuse, and about the unshakable, unconditional, and ultimately life-saving power of a mother's love. And I, Sarah Miller, I learned some invaluable lessons too. I learned that even in the darkest, most terrifying of storms, a mother can find within herself a strength, a courage, a ferocity she never knew she possessed. I learned that fighting for your child, for justice, for what is right, is never, ever a mistake, however daunting, however overwhelming the battle may seem. And I learned that sometimes the most profound, most meaningful revenge is not about inflicting pain, but about stopping it, about protecting the innocent, about ensuring that those who seek to harm, to diminish, to destroy are ultimately, unequivocally held accountable for their actions, their choices, their betrayals. And in that, I found not just justice for Emily, but a measure of profound, lasting peace for my own, once so grievously wounded mother's heart.